When the courtroom door opened, even the court officer paused for half a breath. Not because of the case, but because of the boy who walked in eating ice cream as if he'd stepped out of a mall, not into a court of law. 18, hoodie, new sneakers, paper cup in one hand, phone in the other. He didn't look at the bench. He stopped in the center aisle, took a slow spoonful, then drifted to the defendant's stand as if he were early for a movie. On the docket, it was nothing. State of Rhode Island versus Daniel Connor. Parking in a fire lane under a red sign that read, "Fire Department Only." A ticket most people would just pay. But the benches were fuller than usual, and people sat a little too straight on the worn wood. They shuffled papers, checked their watches, and watched him anyway. Everyone knew the name. Connor. The same name on yard signs and on the governor's portrait. The governor's son leaned against the rail, one foot hooked behind the other. He set the ice cream on the ledge, glanced at his phone, then raised the spoon again. The faint clink of metal on paper carried in the quiet room. At the bench, Judge Caprio opened the file and glanced at the citation. Routine. Call the case. Listen. Decide. Inside, the air conditioner hummed and a pew creaked. Next case, the judge said. Daniel Connor. The clerk repeated the name. A ripple ran through the room. A few people leaned forward. No one spoke, but the thought was the same. The governor's boy. Daniel seemed untouched. His thumb moved over the phone screen. He scooped another bite of ice cream, the spoon tapping the cup. You are charged, Judge Caprio began, with parking in a fire lane on Atwells Avenue directly in front of... Tap. The spoon hit the rim again. The judge's eyes came up from the paper. The young man finally met his gaze. No apology, no tension. Just a calm, almost bored look, as if this were a small delay in his morning. In the back, someone gave a nervous chuckle and stopped when the court officer turned his head. A gray-haired man shook his head once. Judge Caprio let the silence sit. He closed the file, folded his hands, and spoke without raising his voice. Son, he said, this is a courtroom, not a snack bar. You planning to finish that before we're done? Or is there something you know that I don't? Daniel's mouth twitched at the corner. Not quite a smile, more a private joke. He rolled the spoon between his fingers, balanced on one leg, as if the weight in the room had nothing to do with him. On paper, it was only a parking ticket. But as the judge watched the governor's son stand there with melting ice cream and that careless look, everyone on those benches felt it. This was not going to be an ordinary morning in traffic court. He didn't apologize. He didn't even pretend to. Instead, Daniel lifted his chin a little and said, with the kind of casual tone people use when asking for directions, I don't think this is serious at all. No edge, no attitude. Just indifference so complete it landed heavier than arrogance. A few people exhaled sharply, the way older folks do when they've seen too much entitlement for one lifetime. Judge Caprio watched him, not the words, but the posture. One hand in his pocket, the other loosely holding the spoon. His shoulders weren't tense. His eyes weren't defiant. They were tired, detached, as if he'd been through this performance too many times already. Let's talk about why you're here, the judge said gently. Everyone in the courtroom knew the truth before the answer came. Daniel Connor wasn't just any teenager. He grew up in a household where staff scheduled appointments, drivers handled minor crises, and adults around him changed their tone depending on who walked into the room. His father's name opened more doors than his own efforts ever had. Half the room remembered seeing the governor on TV, shaking hands at ribbon cuttings, talking about opportunity and responsibility. Few had ever seen the boy beside him. Daniel didn't posture like someone who enjoyed power. He acted like someone who had never once had to earn it. I mean, it's a parking ticket, he added, as if summarizing the universe's absurdity. The judge flipped through the file and came across the photo. A small detail, a red curb, the fire lane sign, and beyond it, the glass doors of the Children's Rehabilitation Center. Bright posters inside, a wheelchair visible through the reflection. Caprio's brow tightened for a moment. He looked up. Daniel noticed the shift and tried to hide the brief flicker in his eyes, but couldn't. A tiny, quick tightening around the mouth. A blink held half a second too long. Something there. Something not in the report. "What did you tell the officer at the scene?" the judge asked. Daniel shrugged like it didn't matter. "That I'd only be a minute." The judge turned another page. The officer added a note. "He says you told him no one's going to make a big deal out of this." A stir ran through the benches. A woman whispered, "Typical," and clasped her purse closer. The man beside her frowned but kept still. Caprio read the second line aloud. "If you want, talk to the people who handle things." This time, the boy's jaw tightened, barely, but enough for anyone paying attention. For the older audience in that room, something familiar settled over the scene. The quiet frustration of knowing some children grow up learning the rules, while others grow up believing they float above them. Yet, as the judge studied Daniel, he caught something most observers wouldn't have. The way the boy's fingers tapped his leg lightly, not from impatience, but from nerves. The way his shoulders sagged for a single heartbeat before he reset them. The faint shadows under his eyes, as if sleep hadn't visited him properly in a long time. Under the polished name and bored expression was a young man drifting through life on rails someone else had laid down, neither proud of them nor brave enough to step off. For the first time since he walked in, Daniel's spoon hovered above the melting ice cream, untouched. The room watched him with a mix of irritation and curiosity, sensing that the surface story, spoiled boy, powerful father, was only the beginning. And Judge Caprio, with decades of reading people behind that bench, leaned back slightly, realizing this wasn't carelessness. It was armor. Judge Caprio folded his hands again, this time more deliberately. The room quieted, sensing a shift, subtle but unmistakable. "Daniel," he said, his tone steady, "why were you in that area? And before you answer, please remember we have camera footage." Those words landed like a dropped book. Daniel froze, the spoon still in his hand, but now forgotten. His gaze flicked up sharply, caught between surprise and calculation. Footage, he hadn't expected that. Caprio continued, eyes never leaving him. "It shows you weren't there for a minute. You stayed 35. A soft gasp rippled across the benches. One man adjusted his glasses. Another leaned forward as if the next sentence might reveal something long suspected. Daniel tried to swallow, but the motion was tight, strained. I was waiting for someone." A flimsy answer. Even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded. "Waiting," the judge repeated calmly. "Yet the video shows you taking something out of the trunk. A box, handing it off, returning alone." The temperature in the room felt like it dropped. Daniel's fingers tapped against the railing, then stopped. He didn't blink. A woman in the back murmured, barely above a breath, "That's the kid from the story. The one last spring." Her neighbor hushed her, but the whisper spread like a small, controlled fire. A few heads turned. Others stiffened, eyebrows raised in recognition. Last spring, local news hinted at strange late-night exchanges involving children of state officials. Nothing proven, just smoke without confirmed flames. Enough to make people uneasy. Enough to make rumors swirl. The judge tapped his pen once on the file, not loudly, but the sound cut through the air. "Daniel," he said, "the same evening you parked there, something went missing from that facility. Papers, sensitive ones." His voice remained neutral, precise. "So I'm asking plainly, can you explain your presence?" That was all. A question, not an accusation, but it hit harder than any raised voice could have. Daniel's face drained of color. A moment earlier he'd looked bored. Now he looked cornered, like someone suddenly aware that his world was smaller than he believed. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't reach for the ice cream. His hands dropped to his sides, fists slowly unclenching. The courtroom felt suspended, No shuffling, no coughs, only the low hum of the old ventilation unit and the rhythm of someone's anxious tapping against a pew. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, tried again, then stared at the floor, as if the grain in the wood might offer a way out. His confidence hadn't just cracked. It had collapsed inward. Judge Caprio let the silence sit, not as pressure, but as truth. This was the moment where excuses thinned and whatever lay beneath had to emerge. Whatever Daniel had walked in pretending to be untouchable, unconcerned, was gone now. What replaced it was something the entire room recognized instinctively. Fear. Not of punishment, but of being seen. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The judge didn't push. He simply waited, his eyes steady, giving the boy space to breathe or to run out of places to hide. When Daniel finally spoke, the words came out smaller than before, stripped of their earlier ease. "I wasn't there for documents," he murmured. "I was dropping off my mom's things." The reaction was immediate, though quiet. A soft ripple of surprise swept through the benches, the way a room exhales when it realizes it misread the moment. A few people lowered their eyes. Others straightened, listening more carefully. Caprio's expression didn't change, but something gentler settled in the lines around his mouth. "Your mother was at that facility?" he asked. Daniel nodded. She was back for treatment." His voice wavered, not in theatrics, but in the way someone speaks about a truth they've carried alone too long. "My dad said it couldn't get out. Reporters were already waiting in the area. They follow her every time she goes in there." The boy's hands were trembling now, not visibly to the back of the room, but enough that the judge saw it. "You parked in the fire lane because I didn't want people filming her," he said quietly. "They always do, even when she's barely walking. I tried the side lot, but a news van was there, so I stopped closest to the door. She hates being stared at." He blinked hard, looking anywhere except at the judge. "I know it was wrong. I couldn't let them crowd her again." A stillness settled over the courtroom, the kind of silence that doesn't demand more words, but invites them. Caprio leaned forward just a fraction. "Then why did you keep looking over your shoulder in that footage?" Daniel hesitated, deep breath, jaw tensed, before answering. "I didn't want anyone recognizing me." His voice turned rough at the edges. "Because if they saw me with those boxes, they'd know she was back. Reporters would be outside our house by morning. My dad's team would explode. I just didn't want to make it worse for her." That was the shift, the moment the room's judgment softened into understanding. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition. Behind the careless smirk earlier was a kid trying not to drown under a family shaped by cameras, expectations, and silence. The judge, who had seen every kind of facade, watched the last pieces of Daniel's crumble. "You said you were only a minute," he noted quietly. "But you stayed much longer." Daniel nodded. "She dropped a scarf in the back seat. I knew she'd panic if she woke up without it. She always does after treatments. I ran it inside, and then I just needed a second. I didn't want to walk back out into the lights." His throat tightened as he added, barely audible, "Being seen feels like being hunted sometimes." Not a dramatic confession, a weary truth. In the back row, the same woman who whispered earlier pressed her lips together, her expression softening. A man beside her lowered his arms, the irritation gone. Caprio didn't move for a while. He simply absorbed it, the loneliness in the boy's voice, the shame behind his choices, the exhaustion of someone too young to carry that much secrecy. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm. "Daniel, protecting your mother is noble, but hiding behind indifference is not. You walked in here today acting untouchable. Now I see you were just afraid." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't shrug. He just lowered his eyes, shoulders collapsing into a posture that looked less like defeat and more like relief. like someone finally seen without the armor he'd worn since childhood. And the courtroom, which had entered this case expecting entitlement, now felt something far more complicated: compassion. Judge Caprio rested his elbows on the bench, not in weariness, but in deliberation. He let the quiet stretch, a quiet so complete that even the ceiling fan seemed to soften its hum. The boy stood still, no longer shifting weight from one foot to the other, no longer scanning the room for exits, just waiting. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was low, even, grounded in years of seeing the best and worst of people. "Daniel," he began, "life gives each of us difficult seasons, but difficulty never grants us permission to forget our manners." The words weren't harsh. They were steady, measured, almost fatherly, and for the first time, Daniel listened the way someone listens to a truth they've never heard aloud. Caprio turned the folder closed, setting it aside as if the paperwork mattered far less than the person standing before him. "You walked in here today acting like this place didn't deserve your attention, eating in court, dismissing the charge, brushing off the people around you. But that isn't confidence. That's pain disguised as indifference." A faint tremor pulled at Daniel's jaw, quick, revealing, and instantly swallowed. "And there's something else," the judge added, leaning in slightly. "You think your last name shields you. But I'll tell you something few will ever say to your face. A powerful name can be a cage just as easily as a shield." Daniel blinked, startled. It was as if someone had reached inside him and touched the bruise he never admitted was there. From the back row, a hand lifted slowly. The judge noticed and nodded. A woman in her late 50s stood, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided to speak. Her voice trembled at first. "Your Honor, I saw the young man that day." Daniel's head snapped toward her, confusion written plainly across his face. He didn't know her, had never seen her. "I was leaving the center," she continued. "My grandson has therapy there. The boy," she gestured toward Daniel, "was helping a woman out of the car. He waited until she was steady. He spoke to her softly, held her hand. He didn't look like someone causing trouble. He looked worried." A soft rumble of surprise moved through the benches. Daniel's shoulders dropped, the sharp edges in his posture fading. The woman added, "Whatever people think about his family, that moment didn't look like privilege. It looked like kindness." Then she sat down, and the room absorbed her words in silence. Judge Caprio nodded thoughtfully, his gaze returning to Daniel. "You hear that?" he asked, not accusatory, not indulgent, just direct. "People notice when you do good, even when you don't think they're looking." Daniel swallowed, his throat bobbing awkwardly. He didn't speak. The judge continued. "Respect isn't inherited. It isn't granted by a title or a household. It is earned through the choices you make when no one expects anything of you." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself. When he opened them, the old indifference was gone. What remained was raw honesty and exhaustion. "You did wrong when you parked illegally," Caprio said. "You disrespected this courtroom the moment you walked in, but you also told the truth when you didn't have to. That counts." A faint, almost imperceptible nod came from Daniel. "So, here's what I'm going to do." The judge straightened the papers in front of him. "The fine will stand, but I'm adding something." The boy tensed, not in fear, but in anticipation. "You will make a contribution to the rehabilitation center that cared for your mother," Caprio said, "not because you're being punished, but because responsibility should touch the same places where our hearts are involved." The benches stirred with quiet approval, not applause, not cheers, just a collective recognition that something right had been said. Caprio closed the file gently. "Consider this an opportunity, Daniel. Not to impress your father, not to protect an image, but to become the kind of man who doesn't need a famous name to stand tall. This time, When Daniel lifted his eyes to the bench, he looked different, uncovered, humbled, and perhaps for the first time in years, reachable. Daniel stepped back to the microphone slowly, as if learning to walk in a new body. No ice cream in his hand now, no phone glowing like a shield between him and the world. Just a young man standing exposed beneath the dim courtroom lights. He cleared his throat once, the sound barely audible. "Your Honor, thank you." The words were simple, but carried a weight they'd never held in his life. Nobody has ever spoken to me that way. Not honestly. Not without expecting something. He wasn't performing. He wasn't calculating. The room felt the difference instantly, the sincerity threading through his voice, the humility in the way he held his shoulders, the calm in his eyes that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Judge Caprio watched him with the kind of expression older men give to those they hope will grow beyond their circumstances. Not sentimental, but steady and expectant. Daniel drew a slow breath. "I won't ask my dad to get involved," he said. "Not this time. Not ever again for something I did." His voice wavered, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of owning his choices. "I'll take whatever comes with my name off the table." That stopped the room cold. People who had come in skeptical, some irritated, others ready to judge, went still. A man in the front row lowered his folded arms. Someone in the back whispered a quiet, "Well," under their breath, more impressed than doubtful. Judge Caprio nodded once, the motion deliberate. "That's the first step toward becoming your own man," he said. "A name doesn't determine character. Character determines what that name comes to mean." Those words landed with the force of a lesson meant to last a lifetime. Daniel seemed to absorb them entirely, as if engraving them somewhere deep within himself. He stepped back from the microphone. Then his phone rang. The vibration cut the silence like a blade. He glanced down, almost out of habit. But when he saw the screen, the muscles in his face tightened. "Dad." "Governor?" A few people inhaled sharply. The moment felt suspended, hanging by a thread. Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen. Another vibration. Another insistence from the world he'd always answered to. Slowly, quietly, he pressed the side button and silenced the call. For the first time in that courtroom, he seemed genuinely free. Not triumphant, not rebellious. Just free in the small, private way a person becomes when they make a choice without fear of the fallout. No one spoke. Even the court officer paused his writing. Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket. His posture changed, not taller, but steadier, as if he had finally stepped into his own skin. Judge Caprio closed the session with a tone softer than a gavel, but firmer than any reprimand. "Sometimes," he said to the room at large, "a small step is more important than people realize. Families change that way. So do lives." Those words weren't for just one young man. They were for everyone listening, every parent, every grandparent, every person who had ever watched someone grow up too fast or too lost. Daniel gave the judge a final nod, awkward, grateful, genuine, and turned to leave. No swagger, no slouch. Just a quiet walk toward the door, past the wooden benches, past the people who now looked at him not with suspicion, but with a guarded kind of hope. As the door closed behind him, the courtroom exhaled a breath it hadn't realized it was holding, and something lingered in the air. Something simple, steady, and unmistakably human. The sense that the morning had changed more than just a parking ticket.